You're listening to the Bloom Europa podcast, a project that privileges new and independent thinking on Europe while discussing its current challenges. In each episode, we take a holistic but hard-hitting approach to analysing pan-European affairs.
Hello everybody, my name is Adérito Vicente and I'm your host for today's show. So in our second episode, we are talking about how likely is the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine, with Dr. Francesca Giovannini, who is the Executive Director of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. But she's also a non-residential fellow at the prestigious Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. She's also the author of the recent thought-provoking piece on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist entitled A Hurting Stalemate, The Risks of Nuclear Weapon Use in the Ukraine Crisis, which in my opinion led a whole debate within the nuclear field about this issue. Therefore, we will discuss everything there is to know about the threat of using nuclear weapons in the current Russia-Ukrainian war. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that this episode was recorded on the 28th of March and all the events that we talk about it are associated until that date. Ciao, Francesca. Thanks for joining us, and we are very pleased to have you here.
Buongiorno to you, Adérito, and to the Bloom Europa team. It's a great pleasure and great honor to join your program today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let us start our conversation with your bulletin piece that I have mentioned that you have written on the 2nd of March. So you have argued the possible scenario that if the battle over Ukraine drags on the one hand, fresh weapons and other supplies continue to enter in Ukraine, coming from the European Union, the United States, and allowing the Ukraine forces to fight on. On the other hand, Russian forces meet considerable challenges in resupplying their forward deployed troops. The army has visibly underperformed. No strategic objective has been achieved. And for the first time since the beginning of the conflict, the Russian media acknowledged the country's first casualties. As the situation endures, Russian troop morale wanes, fighting becomes sloppy, casualties continue to climb on the Russian side. Of course, this is taken from your words from your article. So, as you said, at this point, the battle reaches to a hurting stalemate situation. My question is, and I'm sorry for this introduction, with over 1 month of war, do you think we reached to that scenario? And what is a hurting stalemate?
So these are two very important questions. And thank you so much for asking me to address this and clarify also further what we are seeing on the ground. So I borrowed the concept from William Zartman, who is an expert in conflict resolution. And William Zartman talks at some point of a hurting stalemate between two parties in a conflict. Hurting stalemate happens when you reach an equilibrium of forces on the ground, and each of the forces loses so much that the benefits of negotiating an agreement outweighs the cost of continuing fighting. My concern in the question of Ukraine, however, is that what Zartman talks about as hurting stalemate between two symmetrical forces might not happen in the Ukrainian context. In the Ukrainian context, you don't have two symmetric parties, but you have a party which only has conventional capabilities, and another party that has both an enormous amount of conventional capabilities and enormous amount of non-conventional capabilities, including chemical and nuclear weapons. When you reach a hurting stalemate between two conventional symmetrical parties, normally the obvious pathway is to negotiation. Like, for example, in the Iraq and Iran war, or in other contexts where you had, two conventional countries at war with each other. Like, for example, Argentina and Brazil, if you want. It didn't reach a level of war, but it was at the level where both countries had an interest in breaking the impasse. But in the context of Ukraine, my concern was that when you reach an equilibrium of forces on the ground with the nuclear weapon state, Russia will always have the potential of escalating into non-conventional capabilities in order to break that impasse and equilibrium in a way that Ukraine is not able to do. So as this war becomes more costly for the Russians will be forced to move into non-conventional capabilities in order to break the equilibrium. And they can actually do it because they do have the capabilities, both on the chemical and tactical nuclear weapon side. Have we reached this hurting stalemate today? I have to tell you, not yet. Not yet, in part because the Russians still have an enormous amount of conventional capabilities they can use. We've looked at the losses from the Russian troops, but to be frank, we know, for example, that the Russians still have 700,000, reserved troops that could be deployed. They still have an enormous amount of firepower they can use. They have long-range missiles. They have new technologies that can be deployed. So the issue on the ground is not yet a hurting stalemate. But the hurting stalemate that I'm concerned actually is not so much on the battlefield. It is mostly around Putin. Should Putin start seeing defections among his generals or among its most loyalists, he might feel the pressure to accelerate and win a decisive victory. And what a decisive victory means at that point becomes a big question mark. And so the argument for me is not so much on the battlefield, but it is more on what happens if Putin is now put under pressure domestically to break the impasse. And that might lead him to consider the use of unequivocal non-conventional weapons that launch a very resolute political message.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about, for instance, the use of technical nuclear weapons.
Yes.
For instance. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. This will be, this will be an unequivocal message to the West, to Ukraine, but also to the loyalist of Putin, that he will not stop under any circumstance. And so even his loyalist, by looking at this, the decision of crossing that border between conventional and non-conventional, might then rethink a potential defection. So it depends very much how quickly he's forced to accelerate the ending of this conflict. It is obvious on the ground that as far as we are concerned right now in this moment, Putin has not reached any significant strategic objective. Now, we've just heard today that Mariupol is now finally under the control of the Russians. Mariupol was rather an important target because it would be able to bridge the Crimea Peninsula to the Russian Federation. But there are many other strategic objectives, like, of course, the occupation of Kiev, as a political symbol, as the center of gravity of Ukraine, the potential occupation of Odessa. All these strategic goals have not been achieved. So the question is Putin able to justify the cost of war just by taking Mariupol? And I would argue probably not.
Yes. So, but anyway, do you think there could be like so for you a decisive victory would be uh, uh, can be achieved without nuclear weapons in this case? No, from what you think.
This is a very important question, and this gets me into discussing what kind of technology and lethal weapons is NATO going to provide? Because so far what we have seen is we have limited the transfer basically of defensive capabilities, the Javelin, the Stinger missile, and the few others, components that allow the Ukrainian to resist, but not necessarily to achieve a victory on the ground. Now, should NATO consider the delivery, for example, of military systems that might tilt the balance over the airspace, for example? And here you see the big discussion over the MiG-29, the delivery from Poland didn't work out. Now, if you tilt the balance in favor of the Ukrainian in specific domains, either the naval domain or the airspace domain, that might actually be a very dangerous move that might force Russia to escalate. So and that might actually then force the Russians to use non-conventional weapons to signal an absolute resolve to continue the fighting, and also an intention to break the resistance from the Ukrainians. So at this stage, we need to look at what other weapons NATO is willing to give to Ukrainians and how this might affect the equilibrium of the forces on the ground.
Yes. So it's interesting that you mentioned NATO, because actually NATO is not the only, or the countries around Ukraine are not the only actors. One of the other actors in the war is also Belarus. And of course, I think you know this, but in the referendum on the last 27th of February, the Belarusians renounced the wording from the Article 18 of its constitution, which had been guaranteeing the country's nuclear neutrality since its independence from the Soviet Union in August 1991. So this results comes as Russia set nuclear deterrent forces on high alert in the context of the Russia-Ukrainian war, allowing Belarus to host nuclear weapons at a time when Minsk has become also in the course of this war a launchpad for Russian troops invading the Ukrainian territory, as it was from the first day, of course. So, in my perspective, one of its most immediate outcomes is that expands the number of countries that could host nuclear weapons, because until now, Belarus, by its constitution, could not host nuclear weapons. So, therefore, from what you said before, and taking into account this context, do you think that this event challenges the strategic stability between NATO and Russia and Europe, increasing the risk, for instance, of the employment of nuclear weapons in our continent? In our continent, meaning Europe. Sorry.
So this is an excellent question. So let's take a couple of points of this question. First is what, as you noticed, there has been a very clear nuclear dimension to this crisis from the onset. If you remember, President Putin, the day before, he basically authorized what he called a special operation in Ukraine. In his very long speech, he actually claimed that Ukraine was searching for the atomic weapon. And then you have seen a series of steps from Minister Lavrov talking about the Third World War with nuclear weapons. You have seen Putin putting on special alert its nuclear strategic forces. So there is no doubt that there is a very clear nuclear dimension to this crisis. I also take issues, I have to say, with the decision of Belarus to renounce its nuclear neutrality status. Let's also remember that Belarus is part of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore any potential deployment of nuclear weapons on Belarus territory would require a change in status of Belarus also in the international system. And that would also mean for Belarus will have to renounce and exit the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You can't be a non-nuclear weapon state and hosting a bunch of nuclear weapons. The only institution that was allowed for nuclear sharing, as you know, is NATO, because NATO nuclear sharing was negotiated before the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty entered into force. But should Belarus deciding to host nuclear weapons from Russia, that would actually have clear implications also on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the international community. Would the decision of Belarus hosting nuclear weapons tilt the strategic balance or the strategic stability between us and Russia? No, I don't believe so. I think the systemic nuclear deterrence is still holding. And in fact, we are quite frankly deterred as you see, by the nuclear forces of Russia, as the Russians, I believe, are deterred by the US and NATO nuclear forces and will refrain from invading a NATO country. But of course, the deployment of the forward deployment of nuclear weapons into other territories do generate major risks. Risks of misperception. They also multiply the command and control structure of these nuclear forces, create very dangerous escalation or entanglement risks. Let me give you an example. Should we, for example, should Ukraine, by mistake or by accident, strike on targets in Belarus, then becoming a co-combatant in the country, would then this lead to nuclear escalation? Now the Belarus is now a nuclear partner of Russia. And what would that mean then, for the further escalation with NATO and the United States? So the more nuclear actors you have involved, and the more the risk of escalation go up. No doubt about this. But again, I think Belarus, before renouncing this nuclear neutrality status, needs to take very clear steps also towards the international community. I want to make one last point, Aderito, which I think is a very important one. You correctly said, it's not only about NATO. And my concern about the way in which we have talked about this war so far is that we have almost fallen into the trap of Putin to depict this conflict as a regional problem between NATO and Russia. This goes way beyond NATO and Russia. There has been an invasion of a sovereign, independent territory and in absolute violation of international law and the UN Charter. So this should not be treated as a regional conflict between us and Russia, but this should really be a problem of the international community. And so other actors should actually try to be involved and try to actually de-escalate the risks of this conflict.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, I agree. I agree. But coming back to what you said about Belarus, you said that basically, if it's proved that that the Belarusians are hosting nuclear weapons in their territory, that is like kind of a breach of infringing basically the NPT treaty. But I think that has to do because the way they enter in the NPT, right? Because of the Budapest memorandum.
Yep.
Yeah, not yeah, because people might think, oh, but there are NATO countries that have nuclear umbrella of NATO, and they are also non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, but they can host nuclear weapons. So why Belarus cannot host? Because Belarus is a different case.
That's correct. That's correct. And, there have been, and very rightly so. So let's remember that, for example, when you had the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, there was an agreement between the United States and Russia for putting under safety and security the former Soviet nuclear arsenal, and therefore trying to give incentives to both Belarus and Ukraine to return the nuclear capabilities they had on their own territory. Now, as you mentioned, the Budapest Memorandum, in particular for Ukraine, provided or needed to provide the security guarantees from both Russia and the United States for Ukraine to give back the nuclear arsenal to the former Soviets, so returning to the Russian Federation. But the Budapest Memorandum was also indispensable then for Ukraine to finally, be included or become a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there have been several commitments that these countries have taken to non-proliferate and non-host nuclear weapons on their territory.
Mm-hmm. Right. So go ahead on our conversation. So imagine what would the think would be a U.S. NATO reaction if in fact these nuclear weapons would be used in Ukraine, even if in limited use, like technical nuclear weapons. Do you think that what would be the answer of NATO and U.S. in this context? Do nothing, more sanctions, continue boycotting Russia, or in fact the first step to a direct confrontation with all the consequences that attach to that? I'm asking that before you answer because recently President Biden went to Warsaw talking about there's a red line either with chemical weapons or nuclear weapons. And everybody's wondering which red line it is. So I would like to know what you think about this.
Yeah, excellent question. So let me address this question on from different dimensions. So the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but even just the use of chemical weapons would open a major strategic dilemma for NATO and for the United States, because responding from a non-kinetic, non-military standpoint would seem completely not adequate to the gravity of the act, right? So, and on the other hand, responding through military, with a military option would most likely further escalate, an escalation that NATO and the United States have tried to avoid at all cost. So what to do? I think this is really this strategic dilemma that, you know, we've been thinking and talking about now for the next 2 or 3 of 3 weeks. You can imagine that the potential use, in fact, I think what needs to happen right now is trying to put together a real coalition of countries that will put pressure on Russia not to cross the threshold from conventional to non-conventional. And at that point, the ability of the NATO countries, the European countries, and the United States to bring into the fold countries like China and India become fundamental. One of the issues that I've been writing about in recent times is there should be, and I'm sure this already has happened, there should be some clear conversation between the United States and China to press China to convey to Putin the absolute danger of using non-conventional capabilities. And I suspect that Xi Jinping and probably the Chinese government have already somehow maybe negotiated, you know, behind the scenes for this not to happen. I think India also needs to play a key role here. And again, we need to do everything preemptively in order for this not to happen. Because once the nuclear taboo is broken, once chemical weapons are used, then this opens like almost thousands of scenarios, and many of them include, unfortunately, a major and very dangerous escalation. So I think the issue that we need to do is really to work right now to put pressure for this not to happen. And it cannot be done by NATO, it cannot be done by the United States, because fundamentally we are now considered really part of this conflict, but we need to have like key partners of Russia to make clear that this is not an acceptable option under any circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Right. You actually predicted my next question. I was going to ask you about nuclear taboo. So, okay. So let's say that actually Putin used nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and we don't do anything. Meaning, at least we don't escalate in terms of our nuclear deterrence. We let him use it without any kind of without deterring it, and also without any consequences for Russia. So this will be the first time since Hiroshima and Nagasaki that those weapons will be used, bringing to an end a reign of almost 77 years of the non-use of nuclear weapons norm, which is the, as you mentioned, the commonly known as nuclear taboo, so profusely defended by IR nuclear scholars like Nina Tannenwald. So then again, as a result of this, of what you said before and what I'm saying now, do you think that the end of nuclear taboo could normalize the use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states?
So one of the things that I think the Ukrainian crisis, in my view, opened a gigantic rift now. In fact, even deeper than what existed before between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. As my colleague Mariana Bujerin has often said, here we have a nuclear weapon state, in fact, the largest nuclear arsenal in the world at the moment, that has gone rogue. And in history, if we look at some of the declassified information or declassified documents, we can note that there have been other wars where nuclear weapon states, in particular the United States, pondered at some point the potential use of nuclear weapons. And I give you the example of the President Eisenhower administration in the Korean War. There are some declassified documents that actually reveal that the administration did at some point consider the potential use of nuclear weapons, but precisely to avoid setting a precedence in the use of nuclear weapons in war, the administration and President Eisenhower refrained from the use. So already at that point, the nuclear taboo became a pretty important consideration for the American administration. There have been also many other wars that nuclear weapon states have lost and never decided to use nuclear weapons. In fact, if you think about the Soviets in Afghanistan, Soviets at the end lost Afghanistan, but never actually even hinted to the possibility of using nuclear weapons on the Afghan territory. So the potential use of nuclear weapons in this context would, in my view, be absolutely catastrophic in the relations between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. And I make a prediction, Aderito, that in the next nuclear non-proliferation review conference that is coming up in August, the non-nuclear weapon states, the international community will demand much stronger security guarantees from nuclear weapon states at this point, because the Ukrainian crisis reveals very bluntly what we've always known, that nuclear weapons afford an enormous amount of power and coercion that no other weapon can afford. And so non-nuclear weapon states are completely defenseless and in the hands of what could be rogue nuclear weapon states at this point. So I think it will be a severe breach of a relation between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, which has already been damaged for many years, but will actually now really have a dramatic turn.
Yes. So again, if this conflict drags on until the next conference, which I think it's going to be in August, because it was postponed twice because of COVID issues. But you know, if it stays like this without at least the US and Russia being somewhat, agreeing with some of the issues, I think it's going to be another, I don't know, might be another fiasco in terms of the outcomes that the conference might achieve, don't you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, I have to tell you, even before the Ukraine war, to be honest, the review conference, many expected would have been a disaster. In part because, of course, the sort of the very slow and, shall I say now, halted movement towards nuclear weapons reduction. You have seen, for example, many of the nuclear weapon states right now embarking in modernization process, in expansion of the nuclear arsenal, like China, for example. So it would be almost impossible to prove to the non-nuclear weapon states that nuclear weapon states are working in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. But this war, in my view, has further reiterated, the danger of nuclear weapons. And I think the international community is taking away from the Ukraine war two opposite readings. One says nuclear weapons are actually really important because of the deterrence issue. They are working today, otherwise we would already be in a World War III with Russia. And there is another part of the international community that argue nuclear weapons are too dangerous. We should get rid of them. So you will see a further split, in my view, within these two communities at the NPT. And I don't think there is any area for compromise, to be honest.
They have been already splitted because of this treaty, of course. But
Yep.
but again, coming back, you didn't actually answer to my question about the possibility of if the nuclear taboo ends through tactical nuclear weapons. For instance, if Russia uses like a nuclear weapon state using nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state, like Ukraine, without any kind of alliances with and security guarantees like others non-nuclear weapon states that we have in Europe or Japan or South Korea, for instance. don't you think that could normalize the use? Like, I'm not saying that everybody's going to do it, but
You are absolutely right, and so that's why I think the President Eisenhower decided not to use nuclear weapons in the Korean War, precisely not to set a precedent and allowing therefore others to maybe follow suit. I think one of the important issues that I wanted to talk about in this context is what seems to me a very dangerous trend when it comes to nuclear weapons. Already for a few years, I would say probably 10 to 15 years. We've also looked at what we call the conventionalization of nuclear weapons. That increasingly, people started to be a little bit blasé about talking about the use of nuclear weapons. You probably remember even President Trump at some point asking to his military, why the hell do I have 6,000 nuclear weapons if I cannot use them? Right? And there has been a trend in some of the military, I wouldn't say the majority, but the minority in this nuclear debate that says, look, at the end of the day, using nuclear weapons is not a big deal. The destructiveness of conventional capabilities is going up. We can reduce or minimize, the yield of nuclear weapons to make them, more usable, so more strategic, more tactical. I think this is a trend that has been very, very dangerous and also very noticeable already before the Ukraine war. There have been several books coming out about limited nuclear war fighting, this idea, these nuclear weapons that can be somehow treated sort of conventional weapons. But there is no doubt that if you break nuclear taboo, you set a precedent. So you could think, of the possibility of other nuclear weapon states to aggressively pursue their foreign policy, first by threatening the use of nuclear weapons and potentially using nuclear weapons, if they don't achieve what they want. There is no doubt about this. So that's why the nuclear taboo needs to be preserved, and the only possibility is to do preventative actions, preventive diplomacy, in order to this nuclear taboo to hold.
Mhm. But again, coming back to your article, if if Ukraine continues to defend himself into a kind of condition of hurting stalemate, perhaps they would lead that to they might lead Russia to do that. No.
Yes, and I think this is in my view where this big strategic terrible dilemma for government Zelensky and his people is, right. So how far are you willing to go, noting that you might be pushing Putin to use more dangerous, more disruptive, and more like devastating weapons on the conventional side and on the non-conventional side. There is no doubt that this is, in my view, that the dilemma that soon Zelensky will have to face, and NATO, quite frankly, will have to face. And again, I think it's important also to recognize that there is a very important point. So we need to ask, what are the objectives that Putin will try to achieve by using nuclear weapons? And we are now in a situation that is very different, for example, from the situation in Hiroshima, right, which you have cited before. So the United States, as you know, before using the weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had actually undertaken a very long, devastating conventional operation against Japan with devastating firebombing, right? And then they decided at the end to drop these two nuclear weapons to force the surrender, the force Japan to surrender, but also, quite frankly, because they believed that their conventional capabilities weren't sufficient enough to bring Japan to, halt the war. This is not the situation we are with Putin. Putin has plenty of firepower to destroy Ukraine 10 times over. The issue is an issue of timing and an issue of messaging. Nuclear weapons are not necessarily for him to win militarily, but it is to say two things. I need to bring this war to closure in a quick manner, in a limited amount of time. I have to be honest, when I read that Putin already has set the date for ending the war, which is May 9, that concerns me gravely, because it seems to me that he is now in a rush, right? And so he needs to accelerate, and conventionally he seems not to be able to do that. But most importantly, is a question of timing and is a question of messaging. The question of messaging is, it doesn't matter how much you intend to resist, I will basically bomb you to surrender. That is the unequivocal message that a potential tactical nuclear weapon would deliver.
So in that sense, for instance, there's an article, a recent article, I don't know if you read it, by Joe Siricion, from the, I think he wrote in the Responsible Statecraft.
Yep.
Talking about that the Putin's using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine is an act of desperation. But from what you say, perhaps could be also a strategic decision, no?
Absolutely. I think it can really be both. You know, like, I mean, partly is if you think about how he decided to begin this war, right? He decided this blitzkrieg very quickly to decapitate the government. This has not worked out. So all of a sudden, the Russians now have to fight. They have to engage in an urban fighting. They have to, you know, try to encircle cities. They get bogged down with, you know, problem with, you know, delivery systems, problem with, you know, food supplies, and so on and so forth. So that could somehow lead him to believe that he needs to accelerate precisely because this war is becoming so ruinous. Not so much, I want to say, in terms of losses on the ground. I think it's been a real reputation loss for Putin. And at that point, the decision to cut his losses and achieve a decisive victory can be done only if he then crosses over to using tactical nuclear weapons or non-conventional capabilities. So I agree with Joe that this will be both an act of desperation, but also a strategic decision to achieve a quick victory, an unequivocal victory, no matter the cost.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then come back again to the NPT regime that we mentioned. So even if these weapons are not used, the nuclear non-proliferation disarmament regime is already suffering some consequences of this. So do you think they could survive as we know it, as it is now?
So the regime, in my view, was in crisis now, has been in crisis for quite some time. You know, you have seen some very clear signs of I don't want to say defection, but weakening of the NPT. I give you a couple of examples. You know, the Arab states, after several years demanding the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone, the convening of the conference with Israel and the United States, decided to take that negotiation outside of the NPT avenue and bring it back to the General Assembly of the United Nations. At the same time, many of the non-nuclear weapon states decided to stop waiting for Article 6 of the NPT, like the negotiation in good faith towards general disarmament. They decided basically to negotiate a treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which again operates outside of the NPT. So what you've started seeing, I think, in the past few years, is a proliferation of other institutions that try somehow to supplement the weakness of the NPT. I think the NPT remains an important, platform for negotiation, but I would dispute the fact that he is now really the cornerstone of, the relations between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. I think something else needs to be done in order to bring back a serious dialogue between these two parties, because the parties couldn't be more divided over so many issues that I think the Ukraine war has really deepened. Will the regime survive? Institutions have a very, they don't die very easily. So we drag on and on and on. And nuclear non-proliferation treaty remains extremely important for the commitment towards nuclear non-proliferation. But I have to say that I think in terms of protecting non-nuclear weapon states, in terms of security guarantees, in terms of nuclear disarmament or nuclear weapons reduction, I think other institutions need to emerge at some point. We've looked, for example, in recent years to to the work that the P5 nuclear working group has done. So there are other institutions that are emerging to complement the NPT, but certainly other institutional initiatives will have to be launched, because the NPT clearly is no longer enough to mediate some of the nuclear risks we are facing.
But that poses me perhaps one last question, I think. So the thing is, there were some countries, non-nuclear weapon states, that actually were big supporters of the NPT regime, but also of disarmament within the regime. And some of them, they were supporters of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But because of this threat perception, the threat perception that they have about Russia, and these countries are not aligned with the NATO or Russia in terms of their security guarantees, they start jumping to the other side, meaning, okay, perhaps I have this dilemma, should I say a security dilemma, and I'm jumping into the deterrence. I'm talking about countries like Sweden and Finland, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
They are making the jump to the other side when they are big promoters of disarmament since the 60s or 70s. Even though they had some kind of close ties with NATO, but still, they remained very much against being part of any kind of alliance. And now, because of this threat perception, they are considering back to the terms. So don't think that we are. This is also a step back from where we have achieved until now in terms of the NPT. This progression towards disarmament.
No doubt. No doubt. I think you are absolutely spot on this. There was an article a few days ago discussing whether the Ukraine war will in fact even accelerate a new wave of proliferation, nuclear proliferation around the world, right? And if you look at Ukrainian situation, if you look at Libya, if you look at Iraq, the usual cases that we normally cite, countries that have given up nuclear weapons or have negotiated, for, maybe nuclear disarmament, they at some point are subjected to these horrendous occupations and military interventions. Now, these cases are very different, and I dispute. I wouldn't put Libya and Ukraine in the same situation for sure. I mean, there are many historical differences, but there is no doubt that if you are a country that has significant security threats in your region and you are now looking at Ukraine, you might believe that the only solution for you to preserve your own survival and your own existence is by acquiring nuclear weapons. Now, I would though urge everyone, especially in the nuclear community, not to overemphasize this point. There are many countries that have made a clear commitment towards nuclear non-proliferation, and they will remain steadfast committed to this. But I agree that there are a few countries, a few cases where the security of the country is clearly at stake. I'm thinking paradoxically about even Japan, although is under an alliance umbrella, or South Korea, also under a nuclear umbrella provided by the United States. These countries might at some point read the Ukrainian war as an alarm bell for their own security. So I do not exclude that, unfortunately, the Ukrainian war will set in motion a potential, further weakening of the nuclear non-proliferation commitments around the world. I don't think it's automatic. I don't think this is necessarily a given, but I do think that it actually might, it might provide an impetus for this. And I agree with you that some of the countries that actually tried to stay at least neutral or become really bridge builders, Sweden had a fantastic role as a bridge builder between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. They launched 2 years ago a very important nuclear disarmament initiative, which was the Swedish initiative, tried to really create a dialogue between these two communities. And now all of a sudden, because of the security threats in their own neighborhood, are thinking about joining the alliance. This is incredibly unfortunate, and it is really an indicator of the perception of countries and the I think, deteriorating situation around the world and certainly in Europe.
Yeah, so just the very last question. This is the last question. But in those cases, these kind of neighboring countries that you mentioned, public opinion and threat perception has an impact, because public opinion is shifted by perception, so they influence politicians to change their, their political vision. So it's interesting because I saw recently a movie from the 60s called The 7 Days in May. I think it's probably people don't know this movie, but it's with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas and Ava Gardner. It's a movie by John Frankenheimer. And basically, the plot of the movie is about an unpopular US president, we are talking about the 60s, that manages to negotiate a nuclear disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union at the time, because we're talking about the 60s, through the Senate, but finds that the nation is turning against him. So to the point that a military political faction plans to take over the US government in reaction to this disarmament pledge, negotiating the treaty with an adversary, meaning the Soviet Union. So I don't want to make clearly the parallels what we have now in the current crisis, but it's I think it's symptomatic about what is happening now, because this crisis is also a nuclear crisis, as we discussed here. So again, my question is, are we closer to continue the path of disarmament initiated by Reagan and Gorbachev almost 40 years ago, or are we actually changing minds also in West, for instance, when we are running for another uncontrolled nuclear arms race, with hypersonic nuclear missiles being its major drive? In that sense, do you think that the public opinion has actually a role on that? So that's my life.
Great question. So if you look at the trends among nuclear weapon states, you clearly see a return of the centrality of nuclear weapons in defense thinking. So we are living in an age where all nuclear weapon states are today either modernizing or expanding their arsenal. Even China, who for many years, I have to say, really exercised an incredible nuclear restraint. China, in spite of its growing economic power, kept his nuclear arsenal relatively modest, in the range of 200, 250. But new discovery tells us that actually the Chinese are also thinking about building up their nuclear arsenal. So from the global nuclear order standpoint, there is no doubt that we are moving away from a nuclear disarmament vision. I also want to say one word about Europe. There is also going to be a return to a over-militarized Europe in light of this Ukrainian war. I think it's obvious from the words of Estonia Prime Minister, from the demands of many of the Eastern European allies, the request of permanent military bases controlled by the United States on the eastern flank, an additional, injection of troops on the European front. I think we lived in the past 10 years with the idea that the Europeans could carve out a sense of strategic autonomy. My sense is that this Ukrainian war has wiped out this idea. I think we are now back solidly into a transatlantic, approach, a rather militaristic approach. Europe will come back to a high spending, military spending. You have already seen Germany and other countries. So we are going back to a very more militarized Europe, no doubt about this. So what is the role of society? What concerns me, Aderito, is this. All these changes, all these major shifts in the nuclear order and in the military power in Europe are actually happening in a time where society, differently from the 60s or the 70s, is way less educated and informed about what is happening. In the 60s or in the 70s, even in elementary school, kids were actually taught about nuclear weapons or the threats of a nuclear use. Today we don't demand very much competence from our politicians on their knowledge about nuclear weapons. And I think this is a catastrophic mistake, especially in light of the Ukrainian war. I have noticed by engaging a lot with the Italian TV media that Italians have stopped thinking about nuclear weapons probably 40 years ago. And I think this is a big risk because we have a society that is fundamentally uninformed and unprepared to deal with real risks that this new nuclear disorder is going to bring about. So you have, in my view, the confluence of different very worrisome trends, and it's really imperative for the politicians, the political leadership, but also, quite frankly, academics like us, to do a better job to inform without, shocking, but really to inform people about the type of geopolitical threats we are facing today.
Mm-hmm. And Francesca, that's also the reason why we are doing this podcast as well, to inform people. And in that note, thank you so much for this talk and for coming to our podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your invitation to you and Bloom Europa, and thank you so much to your listeners.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We kindly invite you to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. You can also check out all the links and resources on the show's notes. That's all for this episode, folks, and we look forward to you tuning in next time. This was a Bloom Europa original.